Today we're going to discuss the information you need to know for the Part 107 test that covers emergencies. Potential flight hazards, as defined in the Airman Certification Standard, ACS, is the common aircraft accident causal factors are inadequate pre-flight preparation and or planning, failure to see and avoid obstacles or obstructions, improper decisions or planning, or misjudgment of distance or speed. You are to avoid flight beneath unmanned balloons. They may have a tether that you do not see. Emergency airborne inspection of other aircraft. Precipitation may cause static buildup, and that's transferred to the aircraft in contact with charged particles, building up static charge. It could cause loss of radio or just everything to misfunction. You could have someone on the ground pointing a laser at the drone or the operator. Well, if it hits the drone, it could damage the sensors. If it hits the operator, it could temporarily or permanently blind the operator. You should avoid flying in the vicinity of thermal plumes, often in smokestacks and cooling towers near power generation facilities. Another potential flight hazard is flying in a wire environment near guy wires or power lines. Operations in the vicinity of airports. Operations in restricted or prohibited areas. So we have different situations that you may have to deal with. The first is something called lost link procedure. That's where the communication between the base station and the drone fails. Hopefully that will activate a safety protocol such as return to home. Flyaway. This is where every effort to control your drone fails. It flies when and where and at what speed it chooses to, and you've totally lost control of your drone, often without even activating a return to home. Battery fires. Lithium-ion batteries are flammable. So when do you have to report an incident? Emergency plan procedures. The PIC should be ready to deal with abnormal situations such as lost link, alternate landing recovery sites, and flight termination, control flight to ground. That may be by you or by the return to home function. Emergency situations is such as flyaway, loss of GPS, and battery fires. So in case of an in-flight emergency, the remote PIC is permitted to deviate from any rule of Part 107 to the extent necessary to meet that of the emergency. Listen to these words carefully. Upon FAA request, you must send a written report explaining the deviation. Emergency. When you get your drone, look at the functions and capability of the drone and become familiar with any manufacturer suggested emergency procedures prior to any flight. So you want to look at, do you need to put in the altitude for return to home? Do you need to return to home where you took off? Is obstacle avoidance on or off? All those should be understood and set before your flight. You should review emergency actions during pre-flight planning and inform crew members of their roles in case of an abnormal or emergency situation. So know what controls are programmed in your drone. How to deal with flyaway, fire, alternate landing site. Should you have a fire extinguisher capable of putting out a lithium fire? How are you going to communicate during emergencies? Who is responsible for what? So how do you prepare for lost link situations? If an interruption or lost control link between the control station and the unmanned aircraft prevents control of the aircraft, as a result, the unmanned aircraft should be set to perform a preset lost link procedure, such as return to home or hover. While an abnormal situation, a lost link is not considered by the FAA an emergency. How are you going to deal if you get a lost link? Should be part of your planning, and once again, is not considered an emergency. So what causes lost link? Typically, it's frequency interference. Drones operate on the same general band as Wi-Fi. So if you have a congested Wi-Fi situation, it may interfere. One thing I have seen is if I fly modestly close to a cell tower, my drone begins to behave abnormally. Another one might be a poor GPS signal, could be an in-flight fire, or it could be the control link interruption. It may be as simple as you forgot to charge the battery on the base station or your phone. So lost link recovery procedure should ensure that the unmanned aircraft remains airborne in a predictable or planned maneuver, allowing time to reestablish the communication link. Auto lands if available after a predetermined length of time, or terminates the flight when the power source is depleted. Another thing you can set in the software is how low will you allow the battery before it activates return to home. Now you may find if it comes return to home that lost link recovers. So many drones have come home, return to home. Ideally, a lost link route of flight avoids flight over populated areas. Communication procedures, do you need to alert ATC or others? Definitely your crew. Also need to plan contingency measures in the event that the recovery of the drone is not feasible. Just a hint, on your control station is typically a distance to the drone. If you can't figure out where it is, walk in a direction, and does the distance go up or down? Turn, walk, and just keep kind of doing that maneuver until the distance goes down to zero. This only works as long as the drone still has battery power. So remember, flight termination is the intentional and deliberate process of performing controlled flight to the ground. Execute flight termination procedures if you've exhausted all other emergency flight termination points, if used, or alternate contingency planning measures must be located within the power off glide distance of the aircraft during all phases of flight. Well, I can tell you the drone has zero glide distance. Be based on the assumption of an unrecoverable system failure and consider altitude, winds, and other factors. If I can safely plan a mission where I fly out into the wind, then I know that any return to home is with the wind and consumes less battery. Flyaway procedures are considered an emergency. A flyaway typically begins with lost link. An interruption or loss of the control link prevents control of the aircraft. As a result, the unmanned aircraft is not operating in a predictable or planned manner. However, in a flyaway, the preset loss link procedures are not established and are not being executed by the unmanned aircraft, creating an emergency situation. You have totally lost control of your drone. It probably will not activate return to home, and it will fly where and when at whatever speed it chooses to because it is out of control. So if a flyaway occurs when operating in controlled airspace that requires authorization and your drone is flying into the controlled airspace, then you are required to notify ATC as outlined in your authorization to fly in that controlled airspace. When you get an authorization, it is routine practice to include contact information in case of emergency. So you need to call ATC. I'm operating a drone. Its last known position was here. It's heading this way, and it is a flyaway, so I have absolutely no control of where it's going. I guarantee you'll not be very popular. So drone fires, an airborne battery fire is considered by the FAA as an emergency. Both lithium metal and lithium ion batteries are highly flammable. They're capable of self-ignition when a battery short circuits or is overheated or heated to extreme temperatures, mishandled, or otherwise defective. They are subject to what is called the thermal runaway. They get hot, and that causes them to get hotter and hotter and hotter, and the heat just continues to accelerate. To help prevent battery fires, the remote PIC should: 1. Prevent short circuits by placing each individual battery in its original retail packaging, a separate plastic bag or protective pouch, or by insulating exposed terminals with tape. I use a Pelican case and they sit individually in little foam slots. Do not allow spare batteries to come in contact with metal objects such as coins, keys, or jewelry. Take steps to prevent objects from crushing, puncturing, or applying pressure on the battery. To help prevent battery fires, you should buy batteries and charger from the manufacturer or reliable source. You should keep track of battery usage cycles and replace at end of life. That means your log needs to indicate what battery or batteries was used for that mission. And if you discover a damaged battery, say a 1/4 inch puncture, it should not be used, marked as OOS, and discarded appropriately. The couple times I've had a damaged battery, I discovered it because it would not slide into the drone. It had swollen enough, and the tolerances are close enough that a swollen battery will not go into the drone.
The unprecedented is completely unpredictable. Who can plan for something that has never happened before? You can, however, mitigate risk and have established protocols to recover quickly from some emergency situations. Also, please remember that if you have an in-flight emergency, you can deviate from any rule to the extent that is necessary to deal with that emergency. However, if you do deviate from a rule, you must, upon request, send a written report of that deviation to the FAA. Read manufacturers' suggested emergency procedures. Review these with your crew. Now, let's cover some situations that you should prepare for. A lost link is a loss of the link between the control station and the aircraft. It is important to note that a lost link is an abnormal situation, but not necessarily an emergency, and it is not considered a flyaway. You need to plan contingency measures, and of course, you need to inform crew members. A contingency plan is a plan that you follow just in case something goes wrong. Flight termination is the intentional and deliberate termination of the flight into the ground. Sometimes this is necessary if you, as the remote pilot in command, determine that safety in flight cannot be achieved. It's happened to many of us. You lose control of the aircraft, the bird flies away, and eventually it crashes. Flyaways begin as a lost link, and the unmanned aircraft is not operating in a planned manner. They are dangerous because they are unpredictable. If a flyaway occurs while operating in airspace that requires authorization, notify ATC as soon as possible. Losing your GPS fix is not necessarily an emergency. You should always practice so that you do not over-rely on GPS help. Of course, to help prevent this, you should always check NOTAMs for any known GPS service outage. You should also make a plan of action to minimize risk. Battery fires. Most of our LiPo batteries pose a significant hazard because they are highly flammable, capable of self-ignition, and subject to thermal runaway. Thermal runaway is a situation where an increase in temperature changes the conditions in a way that causes a further increase in temperature, often leading to a destructive result. So it gets hot, and that makes it get hotter and hotter. You can help prevent battery fires by not using any batteries with signs of damage or defect. Of course, if a battery fire does happen, follow the manufacturer's instructions. Don't allow your batteries to come in contact with metal objects, and don't overheat your batteries. Always prepare for the what ifs. What if this happens? How can I prevent it from happening? What can I do if it does happen? And how can I learn from the experience so that it doesn't happen again?
Now let's talk about you've had an accident. So the remote PIC must report any drone accident to the FAA within 10 days of the operation if any of the following thresholds are met. Damage to property other than the drone if the cost is greater than $500 to repair or replace the property, whichever is lower. If it involves a person, it would be considered a serious injury if a person requires hospitalization, but the injury is fully reversible, including and not limited to head trauma, broken bone or bones, laceration to the skin that requires suturing. If you are required to file an accident report and fill out the form about accident reporting, now the data reported is intended to profile causes of accidents. The data may be used to design future training or revisions. These reports are not intended to be used as a means to penalize the pilot. The FAA does encourage reporting all bird and animal strikes using the online Bird and Other Wildlife Strike Report.
We're going to talk about something confusing, which is accident reporting for drones. And, well, there is optional report, there's mandatory report. Some of them are mandatory for Part 107, some of them are not for recreational pilots. It's just a whole lot of confusion. So let's go into what you have to report, when you have to report it, how you have to report it, right in this video. let's get to it. So you may say, well, what's the big deal about this? Well, the big deal is we hope that you never really have an accident, but you know what? Stuff happens. And when stuff happens, you need to know what you're supposed to report. And if you don't report, well, you can get in even more trouble, get a fine. If you have a Part 107 certificate, you could potentially lose your Part 107 certificate. So there's reporting for Part 107 pilots. There's some of that reporting that also applies to recreational pilots, and then there's also optional reporting. We're going to talk about all three of these. But the first one is the FAA reporting, because, well, we all report to the FAA in a way, right? Because they control all flights in the United States. Well, the FAA reporting is only contained in Part 107. If you're flying for recreational purposes, you're not following Part 107 regulation, you're following 44809 regulation, USC, the US code 44809. Under that, there is no real reporting requirement unless your CBO requires that there is a reporting requirement, okay? Remember, under 44809, you're supposed to follow CBO guidelines, CBO, community-based organizations. If that's the case, then you follow those. But let's talk about Part 107 FAA reporting. And what the FAA says is that you have to report to the FAA within 10 days any operation that involves at least the following: serious injury to any person or any loss of consciousness due to you flying your drone into someone, possibly, or any damage to any property for which the cost of repair exceeds $500, which, by the way, does not include the cost of your drone. How do you do it? You go on the FAA Drone Zone, fadronezone.faa.gov, or you go to the local Flight Standard District Office. When you're on the FAA Drone Zone, as you can see in the background here, you just go to the accident reporting section, you give them all of the information, and then you're all set. That meets the requirement right here for Part 107.